for all the efficiency in Singapore, which I'm very proud of, I have to say I love coming to Manila because of the incredible richness, optimism, and creativity of the young, old, and all ages people that I see here. And I think one of the great things, whether you're in Singapore, and we complain about our city all the time, or in any city in the world, is that as you see it grow, you take advantage of it, but you're always never satisfied with it as well. I think some of the questions that people raised were really good, because it's important for us to demand better things of our cities, which we will all live in, as mentioned earlier. The question of slums is really quite profound. And there were a few years ago, I went to one of the largest slums in the world in Mumbai called Dharavi. And you know, there are no public toilets over there, and everybody's working. It's very difficult to walk through it. And yet, people, even when given the opportunity, do not go back to the city, to the villages. And if you ask them why, they say they would much rather live in a slum in the city than go back to the village because the social mobility it offers their children. And right in the middle of these open sewers and people working, you see these adorable little girls and boys in little uniforms, like running like, you know, a pack of little chicks going to school. And I think that is something, if social mobility, if the city offers that, through better infrastructure, but really through the fairness and access to the business community and through education, I think a lot of these other things will be addressed over time, but that to me is a core of what makes the city really desirable for everyone.
So probably as my contribution to the discussion, I've heard a lot of nice things about what you feel is a good city. It should have a community, because if you have community, you have a higher, bigger, better social cohesiveness, then you feel safer. And transport system. That is actually definitely a very important component of a city. Almost in almost all countries, transport is among the top 5 most important issues. It is the second most important issue in Singapore after the foreign immigrants. It's almost one of the top issues in the Philippines, and in fact, I believe that is one reason why one of the presidential candidates somehow lost, is because of the perception that he poorly handled the transport problem in the country in the previous election. Now, probably one thing that I will be contributing to this discussion is that okay, you have an idea of what an ideal cities will be, but the question is how we gonna go there. Okay, how are we gonna go to these ideal cities that you imagine? And one of the things that we realize when we try to understand the science of cities is that the most important force is the idea of natural tendencies. As you mentioned, people will not go to some other locations and stay in the slums because of the idea of social mobility. It has been shown many times over that if you build without thinking of the natural tendencies and additional cities to decongest a specific location, it will fail. It will fail. It will not work. And it has been shown in France, it has been shown in many other cities because of this concept of natural tendencies. And I think the most important thing that we need to understand when building cities, it is that a successful city is that a good leader in defining or in building a smart city will happen when you can balance paradoxes. When you can balance various paradoxes. For example, there is a thin line that separates a city that is vibrant from a city that is crowded. You need to find a way to balance these two. There is a thin line that divides a city that is safe from a city that is efficient. You can build tall buildings, tall cities, economy of scale. You will be able to make that more energy efficient. You will be able to have better access to amenities. But at the same time, you reduce the safety factors because there could be a lot of catastrophic things, like for example, earthquakes. There will be more deaths. You will be limited to a very limited exit area, for example. Another thing would be robustness and adaptedness. These two things are typically in the opposing spectrum. Okay, and one thing that I realized that why Singapore somehow is a good city, an ideal city, and a smart city somehow, a smart nation, and a livable city, is because they were able to balance these two paradoxes. That they are small enough. Okay, they are small enough to be versatile, which means they can adapt very well, but they are large enough to be relevant. And in fact, when I decided to go back to the Philippines and imagine of which particular institution I will be successful, this is one of the biggest considerations that I have considered, because I think that is a good ingredient, okay, of having a successful system. Versatility and robustness. That's why I decided to join AIM, because AIM is small enough to be versatile, and at the same time, our network is large enough to be relevant, at least in the Philippine context.
I presume one of the things you're going to be doing in AIM is that you're going to be training better managers for cities around Asia.
I think that is secondary. From my end, really, it's the goal, the reason why I returned to the Philippines is to help build a nation, to help in nation building.
Now we're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask each of our three panelists really quickly to sum up what's their key message from this discussion about what should the 21st century look like that they want to leave with you. So who's going to start us off? Yep, go for it. Really?
I think beyond the specifics that have been discussed, what I'd like to do is, I think I'm most senior here among the panelists. I've taught planning for decades. I joined the private sector for a long time. I'm out. I'm doing my own thing. And there's really a difference between theory and practice. But one thing that I can say that applies probably as we plan our cities, that my definition of planning, that is something that I've learned, and actually it's not solely my own, is that planning is the art of making decisions with incomplete information. So, if you want to do something in the real world, you cannot wait for all the technical stuff, information to come in. If you do that, the problem is altered. It's not putting it in a computer and then spinning out and churning out the solution. Try doing that when you're talking to politicians. Yeah?
Great, okay, thank you very much. Ayesha, really quickly, what's your key takeaway? Thank you.
Well, I think the traditional view in a very powerful way to improve cities is through physical infrastructure. That is the foundation of what has built many of the great cities of the 20th century. In the 21st century, we can now accelerate that through innovation, through digitization. So before you needed hospitals, now you can improve healthcare through telemedicine. And I think it's a combination of the two that will make a better city in the 21st century.
Super, and Christopher, thank you.
So again, as I mentioned, as was mentioned by some of the participants, cities is about people. Smart cities, livable cities is about satisfying to the making sure that the people will be able to maximize their potential. And since it is about people, it is about interaction. The most important dynamics of cities is interaction. Interaction that eventually leads to connectivity. And this connectivity is the driving mechanism of any cities.
Great, thank you very much. So I think what this discussion has really shown us is the complexity of creating the 21st century cities. This is not going to be an easy fix by any means, but we've got a number of ideas about what are some of the critical components. For me, one of the most important is the whole question of intergenerational compatibility. and inclusion and learning from different generations. We've got some interesting experiments going on in the Netherlands now about intergenerational housing, for example, intergenerational care centres. One of the things that Ayesha talked about was the importance of the creative city, all the work of Richard Florida and the rise of the creative class. And so to take us to our cocktail reception, we're now going to have some creativity as a key component of the 21st century cities and societies. But before we go to that, let me just thank, on your behalf, all of our panel, and thank you so much for watching.
Thank you very much, Professor Grayson, as well as to all our panelists.
That's one of the most difficult and interesting session, which we talk about smart city.
Yes, yes.
Has this conversation with two other experts changed your mind in any way?
Well,
With your perspective?
I think what we're always looking out for is to learn new experiences from other places that would be relevant and so that we could apply to them. So I think that by itself is so interesting. See what Singapore, Dubai, those are the things that I think are very valuable for many other places in this part of the world.
So if I was to call you a smart city designer, would I be accurate in this description?
Well, in a way, if you prefer to do smart cities as the utilization of technologies to improve quality of life in general, yes, that's what we're always seeking out. I think the difference is that we're also at the lower end of the spectrum, meaning smart cities, you hear a lot about them in terms of pilot projects. What we are also interested in is how do you apply them across the board so things that are market accepted already.
You mentioned something extremely simple, but I think it's very much overlooked, but it's so important. You mentioned that, the building of smart city, you cannot just rely on government, you cannot just rely on the private sector, and you gave a profound solution, which is collaboration.
Yes.
It sounds so common sense, but, I don't think it's something that comes overnight. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, because there are, at the broader level, government is constrained because they're usually not efficient, especially in this part of the world.
And they don't have endless budget.
Right.
As much as we like that.
Right. And the private sector,
They have endless budget like Ayala.
Or they're much more efficient. They're much more efficient. So they're very precise in what they want to do. But in so doing, they sacrifice the equity aspect, for example. Somebody once said that sometimes you sacrifice some of your freedom for order.
For the greater good.
For order, for some order to take place. And sometimes you sacrifice some order for some freedom. There has to be some way of combining the two, that you follow the rules, there is some order, and government imposes that. And at the same time, you have the freedom to explore, to be innovative, and push the boundaries and find new frontiers. I think that's the combination that we're trying to do.
Let's shift gear a little bit. My question is, what is your future reimagined?
My future meaning the city?
Yeah.
Or?
No. Your vision of a future, that is better than what it is now. What needs to take place? A future that is being reimagined by yourself. In an ideological world, how would it look like?
Well, the future that, from an urban point of view, it's really a city where mobility, those are the things that I'm really big on. The connectivity, the environment, and governance all converge towards.
So you're spelling the word utopia in three very different compartments altogether.
But, that's why it's called imagination.
So good afternoon, Professor Grayson, and welcome to the Future Reimagined Summit. Okay, I'd like to start this conversation by asking you to tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do and what you're passionate about.
So I am a professor of corporate responsibility, although I've now stepped down from the Cranfield faculty. So I write books. I try and persuade businesses that it's in their own business interest to take account of their social, environmental and economic impacts, not just from a risk mitigation perspective, but also from an opportunity maximisation perspective. And one of the other things that I'm particularly passionate about, I chair a superb charity in the United Kingdom called Carers UK. And Carers UK has been going for over 50 years. And what we are about is trying to create a better world for people who are looking after a family member or a friend. Very often it's a parent or other elderly relative, or it may be a partner with a long-term health condition, or perhaps a son or daughter or sibling who's got a disability. And I'm particularly passionate about creating a society which respects and values and support those people who are voluntarily caring for a loved one. So that's me in a nutshell.
Wow, I love it. That basically answers a lot of questions already. But moving forward, considering all your collective professional experience, what is your take about our theme, which is Future Reimagined?
Well, I think it's a critical theme because the future is going to happen.
Yeah.
And as somebody said, the question is, if we want to imagine the future, the best way of doing that is by creating it. And you can't really successfully create the future unless you think through what it is that you want to try and do. So whether it's in the field of education or health or governance or the role of business itself, this conference is dealing with some really important, topical, important issues.
What do you think are low-hanging fruits, like quick wins that people could do to start preparing for the future?
Oh, great question. And I think if you're in business, it's to start with understanding what are your social and your environmental and your economic impacts. And you start by looking at where the negative impacts are, so you can reduce those and minimize them, ideally down to zero. And whether that's zero waste or it's sort of looking at other negative impacts. But then to start looking from a business perspective at where are the business opportunities. I think if you're a social entrepreneur, you try and do the same thing, but also then think about where are the potential collaborations that I could have from a business-to-business win-win perspective with companies. And from an academic perspective, how do I need to change what I'm teaching to understand sustainable development and to make sure that I'm properly including sustainable development as a core part of my framing, whether I'm a marketing professor or a finance professor or a strategy professor or a human resources professor and so on.
Okay, yeah, so there's a lot of stuff about imagining, and a lot of us have forgotten that faculty, right? What do you think are ways for people to actually, what are skills that people could hone at this point to go back to at that time in their lives where they're able to better do those things, achieve those things?
So I don't think probably, and apologies to my friends in AIM, but I don't think you learn that in the classroom, whether it's in Cranfield or AIM or anywhere else. I think you can be given some tools in the classroom, but then you really need to get into the field. So experiential learning is critically important. And we've had some great examples in this forum of people who are doing amazing things, whether it's Mr. Michai with the Bamboo School or Runa Khan talking about what amazing things she's doing in terms of health in Bangladesh. And I think the ideal is to go and have a look at some of this kind of innovation that's taking place in the real world.
I love it. Okay, we're down to, well, it's actually 2 questions, but it's my last question. So you've been an expert in your field. My question is, what inspires you the most about the future, and what scares you the most about it?
I think it's probably the same things,
Okay.
in the sense that we face a series of very grave sustainability challenges, whether that's on climate change or water or resource depletion, biodiversity loss. We face huge challenges with hyper-global inequalities, which represent systemic risks to our system of governance and finance and so on. The challenges of artificial intelligence that we've been looking at in the forum. So I think all of those create big risks, but also finding solutions to those create enormous opportunities, whether you are a for-profit business or a social enterprise or a non-profit, etc. So people all the time say, so are you a pessimist or an optimist? And I've come through a kind of a trough of pessimism, and I'm now more optimistic again. And why am I more optimistic? I'm optimistic because I come to Asia and I meet lots and lots of young people, young social entrepreneurs, young people who are going to be entrepreneurs, who are working inside large companies, who have a passion to try and improve things, and they understand the urgency of some of these challenges. So I think involving many more young people in the answers. So people like me can hopefully make a few suggestions, we can make a few connections, we can galvanize a little bit, but the future belongs to young people because they're going to be in it for much longer. So we've really got to engage young people, and I'm excited about that.
Thank you very much. So we end our interview here, and I really am grateful for all your wonderful responses. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Monterola. How are you today?
Good morning, Amanda. You're Amanda, right?
Yes, Amanda. So please tell me a little bit about your background and, how you ended up in the space that you're in today, and also why you're here.
Okay. I'm a physicist by training. I completed my PhD in physics from the National Institute of Physics in UP Diliman. And my specialization is on complex systems. So when we talk about complex systems, we are looking at essentially a system where you have many agents, and simply because of simple interactions of these agents, there are things that emerges, there are dynamics that emerges that is not a result of the individual attributes of the agents, or cannot be deduced from the individual attributes of the agents, or the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. It is somehow a different field compared to physics, because here you are looking at entities or agents that can adapt like human. So when they interact with their environment, when they interact with another people, their behavior changes. So this specific field led me to pursue domains that are completely different from physics. We try to understand social systems, for example. We try to understand cities. And prior to joining the Asian Institute of Management, for about 6 years, I was tasked to lead a team on complexity science in Singapore, with the aim that we will be able to understand what are the essential ingredients in crafting or creating smart cities. So yeah, essentially that is my professional background.
So I've heard, quite a few things about emergence theories, particularly about how, organizations today should be structured in order to, I suppose, maximize human potential and also the productivity of organizations. And I was wondering if you could, speak on that a little bit more. There are a lot of people like myself who work for startups that are trying new models, flat organizations, learning about emergence theory. So this is the kind of information that we always like to hear and learn more about.
Okay, cool. If we will try to understand, if we can, if there's one thing that we can learn from nature evolved in a manner that somehow it is robust and adaptive enough. And if you try to look at, say, for example, the concept of leadership, Okay, that is also those are also the traits that we would like to see in an organization, a robust and an adaptive system. And one of the most robust and adaptive systems that we found in nature are those of swarming animals. Okay, for example, bees, okay, birds. You see fishes, okay, acting in the same manner. And what one of the things that we learned, or I learned, based on the concept of complex systems, is that these systems are very efficient. Okay, they operate effectively. Information is propagated in a very fast manner, and they can adapt to a changing environment simply because there is no leader. The term is self-organization, and the leadership is defined by who should take the lead in a given circumstances. For example, birds, swarming of birds. At any point in time, you just follow simply the neighbor nearest to you, but it is essentially the most important. If you empower everyone, okay, if you empower everyone within that organization, or for example within this flock of birds, they know what to do at any given time, and as a result, they can be very adaptive. So for the flocking of birds, they have seen that 3 or 4 birds at some specific locations where the current of the wind is strongest will allow them to manipulate and play around with whatever will the environment force them to behave. So this is one of the things that we learn. An organization where everyone is empowered to take the lead when the time is it is their turn to take the lead. It's actually more robust and adaptive. And I think for future, especially for human systems, future organizations, the future, everything in the future will require this kind of skill set, adaptability, and at the same time robustness. Those two things are typically on the opposing spectrum.
Well, thank you very much for your. Good morning, Mary. How are you doing this morning?
Fine.
Okay.
I'm almost freezing in this place, but all right.
So please tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up in the urban planning space.
Okay, my field is basically social anthropology. I teach at the ADDO, still one course, as well as at UP in the graduate school. And I focus on issues of inclusivity or people left out. Those have been in my long years in this work in the urban poor neighborhoods. So that's kind of the area that I've been examining, writing about all these years, and participating with NGOs who are working in those communities to enable them to have more power to exert their views and bring those into the decision-making process.
That's wonderful. And yesterday, at the session yesterday on imagining future cities in the Philippines, you made very remarkable comments, and I'd like for you to delve into that further for our audience.
All right. Well, I said it would be wonderful to have a city where, the huge numbers of urban poor have a real place in the city, have access to basic services, have decent housing on site in the city because that's where their employment lies. Moving them into the outside the city has created enormous problems over the last at least 50 years, which have not solved their problems. Half of them come back to the city and so on. So poverty is very high in those areas, even though these are really struggling people who make the city work. Okay, so that was the background against which my comment was actually my concern. Well, what kind of a city do you want? They said, I would like a city where the developers who have in effect become the urban planners who are now acquiring land all around Metro Manila, in Bulacan, in Pampanga, Batangas, Laguna, and so on, going a lot into golf courses and resorts and malls and very high-end kinds of things, on the grounds that that's what makes competitive cities investment, granted, in a globalizing economy. But I asked the question, what is the responsibility of the developers vis-a-vis the people who get displaced? And these are usually, farmers, laborers, agricultural workers, ordinary people who live there in some way or in some kind of small-scale trade. Do we know what's happening to them? What measures do they take? And in my view, they do have a responsibility when they displace. And maybe they have some programs. I just don't know. But I think we need to find out and need to ask the developers, what are you doing? And then also connect with the local governments, because it is their responsibility to make social housing possible. Are they actually trying to make public-private partnerships to enable their own urban poor, not the ones coming from Manila, but their own urban poor, who will be the workers of all these big fancy places, to become genuine citizens? So that was the context. What is the responsibility of the large developers who are buying up or using the land for very specific, mainly elitist type purposes, which provide jobs, yes, but what's it doing to the ordinary people?